Hey, you. Yeah, you. Put down your coffee and crank up your volume. You're entering the green side. Now here's your host, Taylor Mooney.
All right, welcome everybody to the Green Side Podcast. I am your host, Taylor Mooney. I have in the studio with me today Dr. Edward Wright. He's also my professor. Dr. Wright is a professor of Hebrew Bible and Early Judaism and has served as the director of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Arizona since 2000. Dr. Wright's area of expertise is early Jewish history and religion with particular interest in early Jewish apocryphal texts. I want to welcome you to the studio today, Professor. How are you doing today?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've looked forward to it.
Absolutely. So I'm actually in a class with you right now, and it was because I was looking through my...
And you're doing well, I should say.
Oh, well, thank you. I was looking at the course listings, and I saw lost books of the Bible. And, I grew up my whole life going to Catholic school and having a lot of these, or some of these things kind of taught to me. You wouldn't think that... Well, I don't know. I think when you hear Catholic school, you think strict, hierarchical, nuns and priests teaching you the word and you don't challenge it, when actually mine was all pretty much, I don't know if you call them civilians, not clergy.
Sure.
Lay persons and people. And they encouraged us to challenge things, and they taught us about the history of the church and some of the negative things it had done and the Crusades and to challenge things and how to interpret different books. So that all being said, I saw the title of the class, Lost Books of the Bible, and I got really, really curious and read the description and the idea of how the Bible came to be, because I don't think most people, even peoples of faith, usually think about how this book that they just accept as the Word came to be the Word.
Sure.
And so, I guess we can start there. Like, how did the books of the Bible become canon? How did they get into this? You always talk about the bookends, the bindings. Mm-hmm. How did they make it in the bindings?
That's a great question, and it's one I think that a lot of people, not just religious people, but anybody who has any kind of literacy related to the Bible, most Jews, Christians, Muslims know something about the Bible. But like you apparently went to a Catholic school that was very progressive and wanted you to have a good education and not just an indoctrination. Right. So you're fortunate in that regard. Not everybody got that, but I think that's becoming more and more the case in many schools.
Right.
I too had that kind of background. And when it comes to the Bible itself, people look at it and it sits on a shelf. It sits on a shelf with other books. And so it's thought of as a book, when, as a matter of fact, the Bible is really a library. It's a collection of books written over a period of about 1,000 years. And those books, some of them had oral histories before they became written. Those books eventually became books that were, in the phrase canonical, I would say religiously authoritative. And as they became religiously authoritative, people used them to guide their lives. And once this collection of various books were enclosed within covers, it was imagined as a book, one book written, or I think probably the better term is inspired by God, that is a rule for life and faith. So it's very natural that they would view it as a book, when as a matter of fact, it's a collection of books. It's a library that has been edited by people, and their editing process involves selecting some things and not selecting others. And those are the interesting questions.
Yeah, that makes me think that I know, like in my tradition and many Christian traditions, you acknowledge that the Bible was put together to a series of different councils of the early church, and early councils had to decide the big questions like, is Christ fully human or fully divine or both, or do you have to be Jewish to be a Christian, or can you just be a Christian? All these types of questions that these early councils sorted out. And we believe the Holy Spirit was there to guide the men in these rooms or in these meetings. At the end of the day, I was always very curious, because men still decided these things, and men that, yes, the Holy Spirit was there to guide it, and I still believe in my faith and I want to believe that, but still the intellectual curiosity side of me is like, well, a bunch of guys still decided who had thoughts and hopes and dreams and prejudices and motives and politics, and I feel like it's at least seeps through a little bit, right? I mean, because it wasn't, Jesus didn't sit down and create it all and bind it. It was men after him.
Much later. Well, that's actually, again, another great question. Humans created the Bible. It didn't fall out of the sky. Humans wrote the Bible. Humans edited the Bible. Humans passed on some texts and didn't pass on others. Making copies of text was an expensive operation. So they would make copies of the text they valued most. Moreover, but when you talk about the councils and their decisions, those are in fact political activities. The people who were involved in those, the church leaders who were involved in those several councils, had their own views on things. And in those councils, they excluded people who weren't generally already in accord with them. So there are elements of Christianity that were already viable and really challenges to the proto-Orthodox position that weren't included. So their voice isn't heard. Their voice is actually excluded and eventually deemed heretical. So they're pushed off to the side. I like to hear all the voices. I like to hear a symphony and not a one-man band.
Right.
And when you listen to the symphony, you get the diversity. You see the diversity of opinions within early Judaism and Christianity. In the case of Christianity, really the final canonical statement doesn't come until the 16th century. There's still debates going on. Up until the Reformers in the Protestant community, there are still debates going on whether the book of Hebrews or the book of Revelation or the book of James should be in the New Testament. So those debates went on for a long time. The debates are fueled by people's personal perspectives, their political or what we call religious political affiliations, and they're there to make decisions that support their views. As a result, they exclude other views. Right. And that's the situation where we have a Bible that is edited. And that's why, and when we started, I said it was an edited collection. It's edited by people who have interests, and those interests are represented in the final product. They have a view of, let's say for the New Testament, a proto-Orthodox view of Jesus as fully God and man, who came to earth, lived a life, taught people, was crucified by the Romans, and buried and rose again 3 days later, eventually ascended into heaven. And Christians now wait for him to return. There are other views of Jesus' life, Gnostic views of Jesus' life, Gnostic Christianity, centered a lot in North Africa. These views saw Jesus as containing a divine spark, a pure divine spark that was emanating through him. He was fully human, but this divine spark longed to leave his body and return to the divinity in the highest heavenly realms. For them, the life of Jesus is markedly different from the proto-Orthodox or even Pauline view. For the Gnostics, it was the liberation of one's pure soul from their body and ascending to heaven, which is salvation, not necessarily the death of someone on a cross.
All right.
They had a completely different view of that. Their view was excluded, and we heard about it. Paul references it to an extent in a few places. The early church fathers, the early church leaders, they describe as heretical these people. As a result, when Constantine became emperor, he and Christianity became the official religion. They started excluding those other Christian voices. And it wasn't until the mid-1940s when a couple of fellows were out plowing in a field that they came across what we now call the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Library. Those texts came up out of the ground and are firsthand account of what these Gnostic Christians and other forms of Gnosticism believed. And it threw light on this dark area that we knew nothing about, because the Orthodox, the proto-Orthodox people and Orthodox people excluded them.
Right.
But when these guys came up with these texts, now these people speak afresh to us. And it opens up our eyes to a whole new different kind of Christianity that was very popular, but that it was eventually silenced.
And I think that's something that was interesting to me when we were talking about Gnosticism a few classes ago, is that when Gnosticism and Pauline Christianity, which means Paul and the kind of the Christianity we all know to be our Christianity today,
Sure.
At the time though, and maybe for the first few centuries, they were neck and neck, like 50-50 as far as popularity and following, and maybe just through a few different events and a few different politics and Constantine and some other things, Pauline Christianity ended up winning out. But for a long time, Gnosticism was running neck and neck and could have prevailed as the dominant Christian way, I guess you could say. And if that would have happened, Pauline Christianity, which we follow, would have been the heretical version that that we don't talk about. Because when I hear Gnostic or Gnosticism, I mean, I just think like the heretics, or they have some kind of crazy mumbo jumbo, what do they know?
In other words, they succeeded in their job of labeling them heretics to this day.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's how most people, when you hear the word Gnostic, almost think it's synonymous with heretic. I mean, not maybe to a scholar, but to a person who grew, lives in the church. The Gnostics were these early weirdos. And it was interesting. I think we talked about in class the idea that in their writing they viewed our God, the one we believe in, the Creator God, as almost like a middleman. Mm-hmm. He was the
word they use is demiurge.
Demiurge. Yeah. What does that mean?
This is the Creator God who is able to engage with the physical world, because in Gnostic view, God, the highest supreme being, is so pure he cannot engage with a physical world, because the physical world is contaminated. Right. So this God had several emanations from him, the last of which is the demiurge, who is identified as the God of the Bible, the one who actually did the creative activity in Genesis 1 and 2. This, for a Gnostic, is not the highest God. This is the Creator God, right, who is low enough on the divine spectrum that he can actually touch and engage with the physical world. And
didn't they have there was a name for him, I can't remember it, that kind of implied or translated almost to schmuck almost. The Creator God was you want to worship that guy, the guy who does
demiurge. He's the Creator God. He's the physical Creator God, and he is the lowest level of the divine emanations, and he, because he's at that level, is able to do what you read in Genesis 1 of creating, of forming the universe and all those creative activities. The pure spirit can't do that. And it is that pure spirit. I talked a little while ago about Jesus as that divine spark that's within Jesus and within every human being. That divine spark wants to break free from the bonds of the physical world and ascend to that spiritual realm, because it is pure. But it has to shed all of those physical features. It has to shed all of the sin and the corrupting influences of this world in order to ascend. And in the Gospel of Judas, a Gnostic gospel. This is a gospel that's not. This is a gospel like we have in the New Testament. This is a sayings gospel, and in it, Jesus recounts. It's a Gnostic gospel in which Jesus and Judas have a dialogue, and Jesus said that Judas would be the greatest of the apostles, because it was he who would enable Jesus to free from his body, set him free from his body, which means that Jesus' betrayal of Jesus is actually an act of piety and not an act of betrayal.
Right.
And because by leading to Jesus' death, it freed his spirit from his body.
And I think for me, and we obviously in class talked about it at length, but this idea of the divine spark for Gnostics is it was almost like a weird or odd concept, for me to grasp. I mean, if you like you said, you want to be set free from your earthly body, gives you all this divine spark. So it leads to like a different interpretation of whether or not even Christ was fully human or fully divine. A lot of these early questions, and then I guess the idea of what heaven would be for a Gnostic, if I remember correctly, you skip. The goal is to go to the top God, the most, or at least be in His realm, like the top guy who is not the creator God, not our God, not the biblical God, but to go to the tip top. Is that? There's a tip top guy. What's it? Does he have a name?
He's a pure spirit. Well, he has several names. He's a pure spirit. It's a pure spiritual realm. So it's not the kind of heaven where you have a body and do physical things and paradise. It's a spiritual realm. You are a pure spirit. And again, this is a different kind of Christianity. We have other Gnostic Gospels, Gospel of Thomas, Sayings Gospel. They have different view. This is a different view of Jesus, but they're Gospels nonetheless. However, because they were marginalized and eventually labeled as heretical, we didn't know about them. We heard about them from people who didn't like them.
Right.
But then after the Nag Hammadi discoveries in Egypt, they spoke to us directly, and we can find out more. And Gnosticism itself is a bizarrely diverse phenomenon. There's not just Christian Gnosticism. There's Jewish forms of it. There's, if you will, pagan forms of it. So there's to speak of Gnosticism as just one thing it's a diverse movement, a diverse philosophical school.
And there's two things I think that I also found interesting, and maybe it was this Dan Brown craze that kind of put these ideas in our minds. One was different. Well, when we talked about different creation stories, but then we got into how sin was introduced into the world, and we have the Adam and Eve and the apple, but then there was the Watchers and the bad angels, and
this is the book of First Enoch.
The burst of First Enoch, and I found that very fascinating because it places the blame for sin really on the angels. The angels were the fallen, were the introducers of sin, and it wasn't so much on humans and especially women that were the people who introduced sin into the world. And so, where did First Enoch fit in, and why? Maybe in this example, why did that not become part of canon and become part of the Bible? Why did we? Is there a scholarly idea of why? Sure.
There's scholarly ideas about everything.
Everything, yeah.
That's what we get paid to do. The Enochic collection, the books of Enoch. First Enoch is actually not a book. Like the Bible, it's a collection. It's a collection of 5 different tales related to Enoch. Books writings attributed to Enoch, and then put in a collection and eventually got the name First Enoch. But there are 5 different books that range from, let's say, the 3rd, maybe in some views, the 4th century BCE until the 1st, 2nd century CE. So a wide range.
And who's Enoch, real quick, for those? What's his...
Enoch is an antediluvian or pre-flood hero who lived 365 years.
Oh, wow.
He did not. The Bible in Genesis says that Enoch lived 365 years, and he was not, for God took him, and that's all it says. There's no death account. There's nothing else. It just says God took him.
All right.
And so later interpreters came across this and wondered, well, did he die? What happened to him? Well, one of the tales was God took him to heaven. So there are tales of Enoch ascending to heaven. And Enoch becomes a source of knowledge and information because he's ascended to heaven. He knows stuff that not anybody else can know. So one of the things he learned was that sin, the origin of sin, was not Adam and Eve munching on a piece of fruit. The sin came into the world because angels lusted after human women, seeing how beautiful they were and desirous of them, came down, had sex with them, and in the process communicated to them the secrets of making weapons and doing how evil things can be done. These we call fallen angels, or the Watchers, the people who had been watching from heaven. The origin of sin, according to what some would call Enochic Judaism. Enochic Judaism would say the origin of sin comes from those fallen angels bringing that information and teaching humans about these evil activities. So it's a different kind of origin of sin.
Right.
And for some, the Enochic explanation was their explanation for the origin of sin. And as I say, there are some scholars who would even refer to it as a form of Judaism, and they call it Enochic Judaism.
And so, did the Enochic traditions and books end up not becoming part of what we know as the Bible and our canon? Was it just the normal politics and exclusion things that kind of happened to all the books, or was there the politics of the story didn't match what the people forming the Bible wanted to convey? They didn't want to convey that it was bad angels. They wanted to place the blame on humans, and that thus we need to repent and be washed of original sin, that kind of thing.
Well, one thing, and this is what I do, is people in my field, we read all the texts that were written, early Jewish texts. We don't just limit it to the Bible. And once you open up to all those texts, now these texts are preserved in probably well over a dozen languages. So you have to master those languages. We're talking about Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Greek, Latin, Armenian, Ethiopic, Slavonic, and off you go. It keeps going.
Which, for the record, you can read most of those.
I can get through those.
Which wowed me that you could. I don't know any.
Part of the job.
Right, but still, that's a lot of languages.
There are electricians who know all kinds of things about electrical things. This just is language stuff.
Right.
So it all takes hard work. But what happens is those texts open up for us other worlds outside of the Bible. So, for instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran materials, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Enochic stuff was very popular there. There are multiple copies of these Enochic materials. As a result, we know it was popular there because making copies is a time-intensive, expensive endeavor. Even if you're living down on the banks of the Dead Sea, it's still a lot of work. They valued them enough to make so many copies. So for them, it was a form of almost biblical, or perhaps for them, biblical kind of texts. And there are scores, literally scores of other texts that we call early Jewish Apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. Apocrypha means hidden books or secret books. This is a vast literature. There is also a thing called the Apocrypha. That is those books that are printed in Catholic Bibles between the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament. So between the Old Testament, Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament, there are 17 texts that are included. That's called the Apocrypha. Protestants don't include those. The Reformers decided those were not part of the Hebrew Bible. We're not going to have those in. So Protestants won't see those texts. Catholic Christians and other forms of Christians will see those. The pseudepigrapha, on the other hand, is an enormous group of literature of books that are attributed to people who didn't write them. In other words, we have texts attributed to Adam. We have texts that are attributed to Abraham, to Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, to Moses, to every last person imaginable from the Bible. And it's an enormous literature. They're pseudepigraphic in that they're falsely pseudepigraphs writings. They're falsely attributed to people who didn't write them. In other words, today, if I had a text and I was going to have George Washington predict that Donald Trump would become president of the United States, I could write that, and I could put it in George Washington's mouth. But everybody would know George Washington didn't say that.
Right.
So it's the same kind of thing with that. What I would be creating there is a pseudepigraph of George Washington.
And what would be the motivations? We told this in class. What would be the motivations for someone to write pseudepigrapha? Why would anyone even bother doing that?
Well, they think they're reading in the Bible and there's something left out. They feel that something needs to be added here. So there are many motivations. One, it could be for financial reasons. If you write a book, all of a sudden you come up with a book that says, oh, here's a book that we didn't have, that we just discovered. It comes from Abraham or it comes from Moses. People are going to want to see that because those are important people. So you write it and then you pass it off. You could do it for financial reasons. Another reason is to do it for in order to honor that person. In other words, you think this is really what that person wanted to have said, so you write it in a form and use their name as a way to honor or continue their legacy as you see it should be done. Another reason is to get, by using their name, you can get reputation for your work. If I were to write a book about, Donald Trump or whatever, nobody cares. But if I write a book that George Washington predicted it, people would be interested, right?
Right.
Especially in the ancient world. The pseudepigraphy was very common in the ancient world. And finally, and this is something that I would kind of go out on a limb on myself, I think some of these people who write these books, some of them actually had religious experiences where they think they got communications from Adam, from Abraham, or that God was giving them information that Adam or Abraham wanted them to transmit. I think that is potentially a real religious phenomenon, a hope that they have developed on their own. So that's kind of, but I'll be honest with you, that's kind of out on the end of a limb for me.
On the limb.
But I think that there's some kind of psychological and religious devotion that leads to that kind of sense where they're almost like Shirley MacLaine channeling those people.
Right.
And they sincerely believe it. I think that I have a couple texts where I actually think that's the case.
Now, this is to me the big question is there pseudepigraphic text in the Bible that we know, or is the Bible we know is? I think a lot of people, depending on their denomination of Christianity, have their own opinions on it. But from a scholarly point of view, is every book in the Bible written by that person, or are there some or a lot that are attributed to that person?
That's a great question. The most of the Bible is anonymous. People say the books of Moses, the first 5 books of Moses. Nowhere does it say that Moses wrote those books. It doesn't say that. That's a tradition. When you get into Isaiah and Jeremiah, prophets like that, those are not written by Isaiah and Jeremiah per se. They may have been probably written by a scribe or something like that, but they come from Jeremiah. Isaiah is a little more complicated. There's 3 or 4 different sections of Isaiah that were written. We know were written at different times and then attributed. So clearly, parts of Isaiah are pseudepigraphic. The book of Daniel is another case. Most of the biblical materials are actually simply anonymous, and we have the stuff is ascribed to them. When it comes to the New Testament, the Gospels are anonymous. They don't say who wrote them. We have an indication in Luke on who might have written it in conjunction with Acts, but the others are completely anonymous. They are traditionally ascribed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but never does it say that Matthew wrote this, Mark wrote that, Luke wrote that, and John wrote that. It doesn't.
See, I grew up thinking, the book of Matthew is written by Matthew. Mm-hmm. You were just because it's his book. I mean, if it's his book, he wrote it. And I don't think most people.
But that's a religious belief that was taught to you because that's the title that's been ascribed to it. At least I think, if I can remember, the earliest ascription to Matthew is the 2nd century, if I remember correctly. So it's late.
Yeah, that's the thing is, how do you know? Someone's like, well, that's just ridiculous. That's not true. Matthew wrote that. How do you date, or how do you know that? One of these books wasn't written by them, because you can date it to, like you said, to the 2nd or 3rd century. Sure. How is that done?
Sure. Well, first of all, they're anonymous. That's the key to remember. None of them say who wrote them, as far as the Gospels. Epistles, we can discuss that as well. But the Gospels, that is simply, they're simply anonymous. How do we know when those things come in? Well, we know by two different sources. One, we can have documentary evidence. Do we have manuscripts or fragments of these biblical texts that have the name attached to it? Another way to look at it is, are they quoted by somebody? So if it says, Jesus said, ABC, we don't know where that came from necessarily. We can look it up word for word and find it in Matthew, let's say. If it says, as Matthew says, then whoever that person is knows that text as a Matthean text. So then that's how you date it. So by this date, say late 2nd century, Irenaeus or whoever knows this by the name of Matthew. So that's another way of doing it. So there's the textual evidence and then the quoted evidence. So that's how we can come up with dates. And then when you come into the major collections, we call them codices. They're books. Those already have the names on them. So we know by the 4th century those are clearly established by then.
And something else that always interests me, and I think again it was started by the Dan Brown phenomenon, but that is that there was one that perhaps Jesus had a wife and had children, and perhaps that wife was Mary Magdalene. And when you think of a very traditional view of Mary Magdalene, you think, oh, she was like a repentant whore. Like she at one point was that, and she repented, and she obviously holds some sort of favor, but her reputation's a bit sullied. But then there's this other, narrative that perhaps they were actually married, and that Mary Magdalene was actually a very powerful figure in the early church. Can you, one, describe what that tradition is and where it come from, and then why did Mary Magdalene get typecasted this way?
Well, in one of the Gospels, Mary Magdalene is this woman, Mary, or in Hebrew her name would have been Miriam. She's from Magdala, up north. And so what she would do is she's depicted, she's a close associate of Jesus's group. She's involved in Jesus' group. She is one of the Marys. There are several Marys. Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, Lazarus' sister, and Mary Magdalene. One other Mary, the wife of Clopas. So there's several Marys that you have to deal with. When you're dealing with Mary, she is a close associate of Jesus. In the Gospels, there's a story about her that follows a story about a woman of questionable character. She gets associated with the woman of questionable character. Now there are three other Marys involved in the same story, three other women involved in that same story. Why weren't they identified? Right. So what happens is you look broader. We have an early gospel called the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. This shows Mary, and it says one of the apostles says, Mary, you were the closest to Jesus of all of us, and that kind of bothers Peter, understandably, since he's supposed to be the one on whom Jesus is founding the church. But this text says, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you were closest to Jesus. Tell us the secret things Jesus told you in private that we don't know. And she begins to tell him. So she is clearly viewed as, in this tradition, as someone who's equal to or even perhaps more important than the men apostles. She was one of the leading apostles. Now, the Orthodox, proto-Orthodox, if you want to call them that, Bart Ehrman, colleague, friend from University of North Carolina, calls them proto-Orthodox. These people didn't like that story. So eventually what happens is Mary gets tagged with that questionable character stuff. And in her dealings with Jesus, a sweet devotional thing of caring for Jesus gets turned into some kind of, it gets sexualized and turned into like a dirty story even. So that is part of the thing of trying to, I think, marginalize her in a context where she was actually quite prominent. So by reading these other Gospels, we get other perspectives. And the reason why, and religious people, conservative, devout religious people, will, to their death almost, or perhaps even to their death, defend the traditional roles for Mary, because they're convinced that's right. But if you, like me, are willing to look at things from a non-canonical perspective, you can see that the opportunities for understanding their relationships are much, much more diverse, much more open to interpretation. Now, in 2012, there was a document that came up that Karen King from Harvard Divinity School published a small document that was claimed to be the Gospel of Jesus' wife. And it mentioned Mary as his wife or his woman.
All right.
So that was, it's a small little fragment, the size of a credit card. And it's in Coptic. And the day it came out, I remember sitting down in my office and pulled out my Coptic dictionary and worked through the thing. And I thought to myself, this can't be. This is not what this is. And that was just my immediate reaction. After a couple of years, it was proven to be a forgery. And to her credit, Professor King came out and said that, she really didn't get behind it fully up front. She was circumspect and held back some, but in the end said, yes, it's been proven to be, by scientific examination of the materials, a modern forgery. So, but it got a lot of attention. It was all over the news.
Right.
And on the news, on TV and newspapers, magazines, all over the place. The Gospel of Jesus' wife. Finally, we have Jesus married. And it turned out not to be. Now, was Jesus married in actuality? I wouldn't be surprised. Most young Jewish guys his age would have been. Would have been rare not to have been married. But we have no way of confirming it at this point.
Right. And something else interesting we talked about is the role of early women in the church, quote unquote, and that many women played a powerful role, and even a role of being kind of holding the purse strings, or being the financiers, even of Jesus himself, because they were roaming and teaching, and they weren't performing a trade daily, so they didn't have money, so someone had to support them. And that early women were actually held some serious power, but then over time, other things took place, and the
cultural changes.
But so there was a place in the early church where women were not only, looked at, maybe perhaps equally, or their voice was listened to, but they actually would finance
prominent citizens. Take Jesus, for example. The people who show up at his tomb, the first people are women, all three women. His loyalist followers, in that sense, were women. Right. They enabled Jesus to do his thing. Jesus appears at Peter's mother-in-law's house. Paul, in a couple of different places, thanks women for supporting him. Paul couldn't have done his work without the financial support of women, whom he thanks directly. So we know they're there. I look also within the Jewish community. In the Jewish community, we have synagogues, early synagogues, that have inscriptions thanking women for their donations that made the synagogue or parts of it possible. They're listed as leaders of the archisynagogues, as leaders of the synagogue. So women played a very prominent role in these places. Now, because of how Judaism and Christianity developed, that was played down through time, and following trends within society. But up front, women were very prominent, and Jesus and Paul would not have been able to do what they did without support of women, who were prominent women, who were women of means, and who were leaders, clearly leaders. Even as the Gospel of Mary Magdalene suggests, Mary Magdalene was one of the primary leaders of Jesus' apostles.
Right. And, all the stuff, we all the things we've been talking about and been studying, and it's interesting, like if someone's listening, I think a lot of people, if they're not in school, or they're not in a scholarly mind frame, and they're Christian, or especially devout or very traditionalist, you hear a lot of these things, and you're like, oh my God, there's no way. Here's, these heretics are making a podcast or something. It's like, but even like me, like I still believe a lot in my faith. I'm wearing a St. Michael medal, and I have a Bible verse tattooed. I mean, that makes me special. I'm just saying, like, I try at least. And so a lot of these things I can look at in a scholarly academic context, and I think it's really fun to delve into them and get to the bottom of it. To me, it doesn't ruin the ultimate truth of like why Jesus came here, which is preaching to be a good person, which is the whole point, I think, of all that. And and the details that, to me, you can get into the scholarly realm are interesting. But if someone were wanting to hearing this and thinking, well, I'm at least curious about these things now. I mean, you've written, a number of books, right? And I think are you working on one right now? Is that?
Yep.
And so one right now you're working on, what's that one about?
This is a book on a pseudepigraphic text about Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe. And what I'm talking about is, how did this text come to be ascribed to this scribe? Why choose him? And what does the text say? What was its? And I actually think this text is created from 4 different documents. And how did it come together? When did it come together? And why ascribe it to Baruch? So these are fun questions, because really what they're doing is they're reinventing the guy. They're writing this thing at least 300 to 400 years after he died.
All right, yeah.
And what happens? They created a story about him. They reinvented him in their own image. And what I'm looking at in this text is, it doesn't tell me anything about Baruch, the person to whom it's ascribed, but it tells me a lot about the social religious situation that people were feeling at that time. So they're making Baruch their ideal leader. And that's fun, because I'm able to reconstruct the communities that were creating this document, cherishing it, and passing it on. And it became one of the books in the Apocrypha that appears in Catholic Bibles between the Hebrew Bible Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's very prominent. Now, the question about how people should react to this stuff. You're right. This is a challenge to traditional beliefs. It doesn't say that traditional beliefs are wrong. It just says that there are other options available, and that the world in which the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament came into being was a religious marketplace, and this marketplace had plenty of options. And what we see in the Bible are the selections that the people editing it into its final form made. Now, how did they get there? They got there by keying off of what was popular. The key thing is, what were most people reading? What were most people valuing? So when we look at it, we can see this was a collection of texts that were valued very much by people. And so they made them the Bible. Now, that's the Hebrew Bible. There's actually a Greek Bible as well. The Greek Old Testament, if you will. The Greek Old Testament is the Septuagint. Septuagint means the Book of 70. The Septuagint has different books in it. The Septuagint is a Jewish Bible. It has different books in it. It has the Apocrypha in it. It has a different version of the book of Jeremiah in it. It has a different version of the book of Esther in it. A different version of the book of Daniel in it. And it has an extra psalm in it. So what happens is, that's a different Jewish Bible that spoke to Jews who read and spoke Greek, as opposed to Hebrew, Jews that lived outside of Palestine. So there's different communities that these different versions of the Bible set. We talked about the Gnostic Bible. That would have served the interests of the Gnostic community, the Gnostic Christian community. So to the traditionalist who hears these things, I don't think it should rock their faith in any way. I should hope it makes them think about how diverse Christianity was in its origins, and how diversity could be appreciated, encouraged, and welcomed today.
Absolutely. And so the book you're writing now, does it come out soon? Is it?
Well, I have a book coming out in August, a textbook on biblical archaeology and history.
Okay.
That's coming out from Baylor University Press in August. The Baruch volume would be out sometime next year.
Okay. And you've written numerous books before this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if people were interested in these topics, this is a lot about what you write on. A lot of the things you've
just... I have a book on the history of heaven, and a book on Baruch. There's another Baruch book in there. There's an archaeological book that's a very technical type of archaeology book, and then 2 books that are called Festschriften, or celebratory volumes honoring one of my colleagues, Bill Deaver, and another colleague, Lou Silberman. So books that were written in honor of those 2.
And if someone were wanting...
Just look on Amazon.
Amazon? They want to purchase it, go on Amazon? Okay. And then is it you do J. Edward Wright? Is that like...
J. period Edward Wright.
All right. Outstanding. Well, I want to thank you for being on the podcast today. It's been very informative. I could go on forever because I find this stuff extremely interesting and just...
Well, you clearly know a lot about it, and your enthusiasm for it is infectious, so thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially when you grow up around these things, and again, like it goes to everything you're just saying, you don't have to necessarily not believe your faith anymore, but, to have to me, this is my opinion, to have a true... strong foundation in faith, you should listen to every other opinion and listen to other things. Even at the end of the day, if you don't like it, believe it, or you find error in it, fine. But you shouldn't exclude other points of view and never listen to it. So that's why, and that's why I find all this fascinating. So I want to thank Professor Wright for coming on the podcast today. If you're listening, remember, whatever platform you're listening on, if you can rate, review, hopefully preferably, but if not, that's okay too. I'd appreciate it. And with that, you've been listening to the Greenside Podcast.